Imagine living in a world where winter could kill, the sea could swallow you whole, and your next meal depended on how well you prepared 6 months ago. That was life for the Vikings. No grocery stores, no ice chests, and certainly no refrigerators humming in the corner. Just bitter cold, unpredictable seasons, and the looming threat of starvation if you didn't get it right. In that world, preserving meat wasn't a culinary trend, it was a survival mandate. And the Vikings, with all their raiding, farming, and sailing, became masters of the art. Salt was one of the oldest weapons in their arsenal. And though they didn't always have it in abundance, like Mediterranean traders, they knew how to make what they had count. In coastal areas, salt could be extracted by boiling seawater over fires or collecting evaporated residue in shallow pans. Inland, they traded for it with neighboring tribes or through long-distance networks that crisscrossed early medieval Europe. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was currency. A preservative so valuable, it determined whether your winter meals were safe or rotten. Vikings would butcher pigs, cattle, or game after the harvest season, usually in late autumn. This was strategic. The cold weather helped slow spoilage, and animals were at their fattest after grazing all summer. Cuts of meat were rubbed down with thick layers of coarse salt and sometimes stacked in barrels or wooden crates. The salt would draw moisture out of the muscle fibers, a process known as osmosis, effectively dehydrating the meat and creating a hostile environment for bacteria. This wasn't casual seasoning, it was full coverage, like armor for your food. Longer the meat cured in salt, the longer it could last. Some records and archaeological finds suggest that salted meat could keep for months if stored properly, especially in dry or cool places like basements, cellars, or even buried underground. It might be chewy, overly briny, or tough, but it kept people alive through endless storms and snow. But the Vikings weren't content with just one method. They layered their strategies like shields on a longship. That's where smoke came in. Salt alone could keep meat from spoiling, but smoking took things to a whole new level. It added another layer of protection, both physically, through the dehydration it caused, and chemically, by infusing the meat with antimicrobial compounds. Found in wood smoke. Inside Viking longhouses, the hearth was always burning. There were no chimneys, just an open hole in the roof to vent smoke. This meant the upper rafters were constantly filled with warm, smoky air, the perfect environment to hang strips of salted meat for further preservation. Some homes even had smoke lofts where meat, fish, and sausages were suspended above them. Flames for days or even weeks. The choice of wood was important. Birch, alder, and juniper were commonly available and gave distinct flavors to the meat. Birch was slightly sweet, alder was mild and earthy, and juniper added a hint of bitterness that actually helped with preservation. Over time, families developed preferences and traditions around which woods to use for different types of meat. It became an inherited craft, how your father smoked lamb, how your mother salted the fish, how your grandparents stored it all. Salt and smoke created food that could travel. Viking ships were stocked with smoked and cured meats before every expedition. Whether they were headed to raid the English coast or settle in Greenland, they knew they couldn't rely on foraging alone. These preservation methods were their pantry at sea. Meat had to survive briny air, fluctuating temperatures, and months in damp hulls. Then somehow, it did. The genius wasn't just in the method, it was in the mindset. The Vikings didn't see preservation as a backup plan. It was an essential part of their lifestyle. A successful household wasn't just marked by how much they harvested, but by how long their food could last after the harvest was over. In a land where growing seasons were short and winters were long, a single mistake could mean starvation. So they treated every slab of meat like an investment. Salted, smoked, packed away, saved for the storm that would inevitably come. Their techniques weren't written in books, but carved into routine. passed down in gestures, in tasks repeated. By hand, by instinct, by necessity. There was no instruction manual, no thermometer, no timer. Just observation, experience, and an unforgiving environment that punished failure. And yet, they thrived. With no refrigerators, no electricity, and no margin for error, the Vikings turned meat preservation into a quiet kind of genius one that kept them fed through darkness, cold, and war. Got step inside a Viking smokehouse, not a building with signs or furniture, but a corner of the longhouse, thick with wood smoke and shadow. You'd see long racks made from stripped branches, ropes twisted from animal sinew or hair, and hanging from them, slabs of meat quietly transforming. The air is dense, warm, tinged with the sharp scent of birch and meat fat. It's not comfortable. It's not meant to be. It's a workshop of preservation. A space where sustenance is engineered, one slow burn at a time. Smoking wasn't just a flavor enhancer for the Vikings, it was a lifeline. After salting, meat still retained some internal moisture, which could invite bacteria if left unchecked. Smoking helped dry the outer surface, sealing it in a crust that hardened over time. This outer layer, often dark and tough, was like a natural casing, a barrier to decay. Beneath it, the meat could remain safe for weeks or months, especially in the cold. Vikings didn't have the luxury of uniformity. Every batch of meat was a bit different, depending on the animal, the wood used, the weather, and even the shape of the meat. So they developed an instinct for timing. Too little smoke and the meat would rot. Too much and it would be leathery. Or bitter. They adjusted by touch, smell, and appearance, knowing that preservation was a balance, not a formula. But they didn't just smoke meat, they smoked fish too. Herring, salmon, trout, whatever could be caught in abundance. Fish was more perishable than red meat, so they acted fast, gutting and salting it immediately, then hanging it above the fire to smoke. In coastal regions, fish smokers were an everyday part of life. And during peak fishing seasons, entire communities would reek of smoke and brine, a smell that to us might seem overwhelming, but to them meant survival. They also built outdoor smoking racks when weather allowed. These were primitive structures, tripods, lattice, or scaffolds made from driftwood or saplings. Fires were built low, and green branches added to the flames created thick, cool smoke. This kind of cold smoking could take days, but it was gentler, and allowed the meat to remain moist inside. If the weather turned bad, they'd bring it back inside or build a lean-to keep the rain off. Preserved meat wasn't just for storage. It shaped how they ate. Boiling was the preferred cooking method, so dried or smoked meat would be chopped and thrown into cauldrons of porridge, cabbage, or root vegetables. The flavors infused the dish, and the fat helped stretch calories during lean times. Meat wasn't served in slices on plates. It was repurposed into survival food, repacked with nutrients, reheated as needed. But smoking didn't work everywhere. In wet or stormy weather, the smoke wouldn't take. That's when Vikings turned to wind-drying. On cliffsides or rooftops, they'd hang meat or fish in mesh or netting, letting the constant cold wind strip moisture from the flesh. It wasn't as effective as smoke, but it worked if the air was dry. Combined with salting, it was enough to extend the life of the food for months, and every Viking homestead had a storage plan. After meat was smoked or dried, it was stored in sacks of straw, buried in clay pots, or hung in rafters away from pests. In colder climates, it might even be frozen in earthen pits during winter, naturally preserved by the frost. And while it might not sound appetizing, it worked. Their food didn't just last, it fueled voyages, sustained armies, and supported entire communities through brutal winters. Preservation wasn't an afterthought. It was part of the calendar, as regular as harvest or raiding season. Children learned how to salt pork before they learned to ride. Elders checked the racks, adjusted the fires, made judgment calls on whether the smoke was too thick or too thin. It was all memory and muscle. They didn't need recipes. Their methods were stitched into the rhythm of life. Smoke was a constant. Presence on their clothes, in their lungs, and in the very meat that kept them alive. By the time a Viking set sail or marched to war, he wasn't just armored in iron. He was armored by preparation. And that strip of dried lamb in his belt pouch? That was more than food. That was foresight, patience, and knowledge passed down from fire to fire, father to son, generation to generation. Drying meat might seem primitive by today's standards, but for the Vikings, it was nothing short of brilliant. It didn't require firewood. It didn't require salt. All it needed was time, patience, and the elements, something Scandinavia had in spades. Dry air, cold wind, and long stretches of cool weather provided the perfect setting for one of the most efficient preservation methods in human history. And the Vikings knew exactly how to harness it. Once the autumn butchering season wrapped up, it was game time. Strips of meat, usually from animals like sheep, pigs, or reindeer, were sliced thin to maximize surface area and allow for quicker dehydration. These strips would be hung on wooden racks outside, away from the ground and hungry scavengers. The racks themselves were simple but effective, just a few coals lashed together, positioned to catch the wind but stay out of the rain. These makeshift drying stations could be found outside Viking homes, on ship decks, or even in shared communal areas. The process took several days to a couple of weeks, depending on weather conditions. Drying too quickly could make the outside crusty, while the inside remained moist, a recipe for mold. Too slow, and bacteria might get a foothold before the drying finished. It was a delicate dance, and the Vikings relied on instinct and practice more than precise measurements. They learned to read the air. A change in wind direction or a sudden rise in humidity could send them running to rescue half-dried meat before it spoiled. And it wasn't just meat. Fish drying was even more common. In coastal villages, cod and herring were cleaned, salted, and then stretched out on open racks known as hjell. These towering wooden structures dotted the Norwegian coastline, turning entire shorelines into massive outdoor pantries. The dried cod, once fully cured, was called stockfish. Durable, it could last years. It was tough, yes. You didn't bite into it like jerky. You soaked it, boiled it, or beat it with a hammer to tenderize it. But it kept people alive through winters where nothing grew and snow piled high against the doors. Stockfish was also big business. It became a major Viking trade good, shipped to markets across Europe. German towns, English ports, and even Mediterranean cities welcomed Viking merchants bearing barrels of this hard, dry fish. It was one of the few foods that could survive long voyages without spoiling, and for many coastal settlements, it was worth more than gold. Imagine that a fish caught in the Arctic Circle, dried by northern winds, ending up on a Roman table, hundreds of miles away. That's the reach of Viking ingenuity. Dry meat had its place too. It was lighter than salted or smoked meat, making it ideal for warriors on the move. Vikings could pack it into leather pouches or linen sacks, carrying days' worth of nutrition without needing fire or water. If they wanted a meal, they could chew it as is or toss it into a pot of porridge or broth. The meat would soften and release its oils, turning simple gruel into a protein-packed feast. Not gourmet, but effective. And after a day of rowing, raiding, or hiking through mountain passes that mattered more than taste, and sometimes they took it a step further. There are accounts and oral traditions suggesting that Vikings created meat blends similar to what Native Americans would later call pemmican. They'd mash dried meat into a paste, mix it with rendered fat, maybe even dried berries, and pack it into airtight containers like animal bladders or sealed pots. This created a high-calorie, compact energy source that didn't spoil easily and could be eaten cold, perfect for survival, long hunts, or harsh winters. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. What's remarkable about drying is that it required so little, no fire, no constant attention, just the ability to adapt to nature. The Vikings didn't fight the weather. They worked with it. And that mindset shaped everything they did. Whether they were in Norway, Iceland, or the Faroe Islands, they knew how to make the land work for them, even when it was frozen, wet, and unforgiving. Drying wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. And in Viking culture, reliability was everything. You couldn't afford to roll the dice on whether your food would last, so they stuck to what worked. Strip it, hang it, wait. And when the time came, you had a pantry full of protein hanging from your rafters or stacked in your ship hold. That's how they fed armies. That's how they survived winters. And that's how they reached the ends of the known world, one piece of dried meat at a time, not by now. It's clear the Vikings didn't need modern tools to keep their meat fresh. But perhaps what's most fascinating is how they turned their entire environment into a preservation system. They didn't rely on one method, they combined many. And when even salt, smoke, and drying weren't enough, they turned to something few would expect: fermentation, fat sealing, and the brutal but effective deep freeze of Scandinavian winters. Fermentation wasn't just a strange culinary quirk, it was a calculated survival strategy. In places like Iceland, where wood was scarce and the climate brutal, fermenting fish became a staple. The infamous Icelandic Hakarl fermented shark originates from Viking-era practices. The meat was toxic when fresh, so it had to be buried underground to break down naturally, then dried for months. Yes, the smell is infamous. Yes, the taste is questionable. But in a place where not much grows, and protein is hard to come by, it was a matter of necessity. Less extreme were fermented herring, trout, or lamb placed in barrels or earthenware jars with salt, whey, or brine, then left to ferment in cool storage. Over time, bacteria converted sugars into acids that kept the meat from spoiling. This gave the food a sour, pungent flavor, but more importantly, it extended its shelf life by weeks or even months. In a world where time was a luxury, fermentation was a slow-motion gift. Vikings also used fat as a preservation tool, though not quite the same way as the later Amish would with rendered lard. Instead of sealing raw meat under a thick layer of fat, Vikings would often cook stews or roasts, then let the fat rise to the top and solidify in storage containers. This top layer hardened into a natural seal that kept out air and bacteria. It was an early version of confit accidental, maybe, but effective. And since fat was precious, nothing went to waste. The same fat used to cook became the medium to preserve. It was self-contained sustainability. But the most underappreciated preservation method the Vikings used was simply winter. Northern winters are cold enough to turn the earth itself into a refrigerator. After the autumn slaughter, large cuts of meat could be buried in snowbanks, stored in root cellars, or hung in sheds exposed to sub-zero air. The meat would freeze solid, sometimes for months, and remain perfectly preserved until it was needed. There was no need for iceboxes or chemicals, just raw, natural cold. Of course, that came with risks. Freeze-thaw cycles could damage the texture of meat or open it up to spoilage. So the Vikings adapted by wrapping meat in straw, cloth, or hides natural. Insulation that protected against temperature fluctuations. In harsher climates, families even dug underground storage pits to maintain stable, cold conditions year-round. The more sophisticated setups had wooden walls, drainage systems, and ventilation holes. It wasn't a commercial freezer, but it served the same purpose. This kind of forethought wasn't rare, it was expected. Viking families had to plan their preservation methods months in advance. They knew which animals to slaughter, how much meat to store, and which preservation techniques to use depending on the season. Summer might favor drying. Autumn was for salting and smoking. Winter was for freezing. And fermentation? That was the wild card, a method that could stretch food supplies long after others ran out. These traditions weren't written down. They weren't taught in schools. They were lived, passed from hand to hand, parent to child. Every scrape of salt, every wisp of smoke, every tied bundle of meat drying on a windy rack, it all meant survival. It meant that when spring came, and the rivers thawed, and the ships set sail again, there would be strong hands and full stomachs on board. Today, it's easy to take preservation for granted. We open a fridge, we seal food in plastic. We toss out what spoils, but the Vikings couldn't afford waste. They couldn't afford forgetfulness. They preserved not just meat, but knowledge. A practical, gritty, deeply earned knowledge of how to keep going when the world turned cold, so the next time you see snow, or light a fire, or season your food with a bit of salt, remember, for the Vikings, those weren't just elements. They were allies, and they wielded them with skill, grit, and a little bit of magic-y, enough to conquer winter, cross oceans, and feed an empire built not just on steel, but on the quiet, brilliant art of keeping meat alive.